Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your host, and today we have one in our occasional series, Voices of Our Lives, in which we talk to an individual who's been important and inspirational in our movement. Such a man is here with us today, Jon Davidson, who is Senior Counsel at the Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, Western Region, which is based here in LA. Welcome, Jon.
Happy to be here.
Happy that you're here too. You've been on the show a couple of times and we've talked about important and substantive issues, no doubt. But today this is really all about you. There are a number of folks in our movement that probably never set out to be heroes of the movement. If you would have asked them early in their careers, what do you want to be when you grow up? They may not have said a gay activist or one of the most important attorneys in the gay movement. That would be my characterization of you. But kind of interested in sort of how you end up in a situation like that. Let's start early on. Where were you born and where'd you grow up and what were your folks like and stuff like that?
I was born in New York City, and my father worked as a hospital administrator for the Veterans Administration. Oh. And it was kind of like being an Army brat. Every time he got promoted, we got transferred somewhere else. And we moved around a lot when I was growing up. I grew up between New York, Iowa, Buffalo, New York, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, here in LA, and in Fallstridge, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. We had a very close family. I have one older brother, and because we moved around a lot, it was really the four of us that formed a very tight unit when I was growing up.
So did you spend more time in a particular area, or really just a few years in California, a few years in Virginia?
I went to junior high school and high school here in LA, and so LA really kind of feels like home of all the places, but I think I kind of had a good sense of what some smaller communities were like and kind of what the Midwest was like, what the South was like. I think it was a broadening experience, though kind of difficult when I was growing up, having to move every couple years and try to readjust to different school systems and to making friends in different places. But there were parts of it that were really educational for me.
Well, you've been one of the people in our movement and in crafting legal theory for the movement that has always emphasized our connection to other movements. And I know, given what I know sort of about your age, that you probably would have been in junior high and high school around the student revolution times. Did that affect you in terms of how you thought about, I guess, what other people would call politics, but I call sort of substance?
It did, yeah. I mean, I think I was really kind of in junior high school and high school in the early 70s, so I missed some of the most revolutionary period of the late 60s. But still, there was a lot of activity, and I kind of got involved as just a participant in rights of farm workers. When I was in junior high school, and in local efforts to question our involvement in Vietnam. Since my father worked for the government, it was always an issue for him as to how involved he would be in any political activities, but he certainly had a strong political voice at home and used to play devil's advocate in debates with us. But I remember kind of one of my real proudest moments was when he just really couldn't take it anymore and joined me with my mom and to one of the moratoriums up at UCLA because he felt so strongly about what was going on in the war.
So is that what led you? I mean, it's interesting to me. We don't always know why we do stuff, especially in junior high, but there's this sense, I hear young people say, well, you know, that's not fair, or that's just not right. And not everyone means it about the same thing, but what was it that made you early on choose to engage in these kinds of things? Why the farm workers? Why against the war? You know, why not the young Republicans?
I think you have to blame it on Frank Capra.
Frank Capra?
No, I used to watch a lot of old movies, and I think there were certain movies that were about kind of justice to the ordinary person that struck a chord with me. you know, that and just, you know, kind of watching the news. It certainly was not just from peers, because I remember when we lived in Falls Church, it was a very conservative Republican community where I have this distinct memory of the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there were students in my school who were clapping when they heard the news, and I was just in shock. And so I think it came more from home, and I read voraciously.
In your own family, ethnic or religious, did you experience prejudice in your family?
We're Jewish, and I certainly had some sense of that when we lived in Virginia. You know, I lived in West LA when I grew up here, and certainly
didn't
really feel
eh?
it at all. But back there, I was one of 2 kids who were Jewish in my junior high school in Virginia, and there certainly was a lot of open prejudice, and you know, I think growing up with at least that sense of feeling different in many ways made me identify with lots of minority communities.
In terms of sexuality, often I'm struck by the fact that men in our community say, "Oh, I knew I was gay when I was 4 years old," you know, or 5 years old, and women say, "My God, I was married for 6 years before I knew I was a lesbian." How did this sort of dawning realization about your sexual orientation come to you, and what kind of part of your history?
You know, I think it came in fits and starts. It was not all at once that I figured it out, but you know, I can identify things when I was very young. You know, when people ask you as your little kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? My favorite answer early on was that I wanted to be in musical theater.
Oh, clearly gay then.
That's it. I fit the stereotype. That's still a love of mine, but not as a participant. And you know, I think that I remember when I was going to high school in Los Angeles, one day there were some speakers who actually came on campus, and this was pretty early, this was in the 70s, came on campus who were talking about gay issues. And I went, and it really kind of, I was upset about it. And I think that was because I was still in some denial about what was going on. Not upset that they shouldn't be there, but like, what were they talking about? And this seemed odd to me. But you know, it really was not until I was in law school that I really started to come out to people. And it's so funny when you were saying early on about people not really setting out to end up doing this kind of work. I remember when I came out to my parents, them being concerned about, well, if I let other people know, what impact this could have on my career.
Sure.
And it's so funny that it's become my career.
I know my mother once said to me when I was at the Women's Law Center, "Listen, honey, if it wasn't for prejudice, you wouldn't have any work at all." I think they really understand after a while.
Right.
So what was the response, did you, in your family? I mean, it's always hard for us to come out to the people closest to us, but they're usually among the first we do. Is that the way it was with you?
You know, I think, you know, ultimately my parents were very, very supportive. I think it took them a little while, and what made it easier for me was realizing that it had taken me quite a while, and that I had to understand that they had their own process to go through.
Sure.
And it's funny, I didn't come out to my brother, who's 3 years older than me, until much later. And I remember when I ultimately took a job doing full-time lesbian and gay rights work, I was kind of relieved, thinking, well, now I won't need to come out to people anymore, because they'll just know. And I ended up having a conversation with my brother when I was saying something to him about getting involved with this man that I had met. And he looked at me and said, "What are you saying to me?" And I said, "Well, you know I'm gay." And he said, "What?" And I was like, well, I don't see how you could not know. There's been like things in newspaper articles I know you've read that referred to me as a gay lawyer. And he said, well, I just thought they meant that you did gay rights work. I mean, you do women's rights work as well, and you're not a woman.
You can't know a thing until you want to know it. I mean, there's no question about that. Well, it's bad enough that you were gay, but what about a lawyer? I mean, no. Seriously, what made you... I mean, that's another career choice that I certainly am familiar with, but in your case, what made you want to go to law school as opposed to some other profession or, you know, graduate school?
Well, when I was in college, I actually thought that I was either going to end up as an English professor or as a psychologist. But at the time that I was there in college, it seemed that all of the people who I knew who were getting graduate degrees in English were working as taxi cab drivers and bartenders and secretaries. And all the therapists seemed to have serious psychological problems of their own. You know, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I remember coming home for some holiday, and my brother had started law school at UCLA. And I went with him one day just to see what it was like. And I was really excited about it. You know, it seemed to me that law presented power and tools for thinking about things in very clear ways and for being able to change things in society, change the way people think about things. It was a strong force for argument and persuasiveness.
But you didn't go into doing civil rights work, certainly not professionally right away after law school.
Not initially, no. After I graduated from law school, I worked for a federal judge for a year, which was a wonderful experience. And then I went to work for one of the large law firms in Los Angeles, Irell and Manila. I did mostly litigation related to the entertainment industry and to the media. And it was very interesting work. But I started also doing some what they call pro bono work. That work I found really turned me on in a way that the other work really didn't. We did one very large case where I was the head of a team of 20 lawyers who were working to reform the way in which housing is provided to homeless people in LA County, and got a lot of reforms done on inspections of those facilities and ways of making sure that they were safe and not filled with rodents and that sort of thing. And then I did a case with a lawyer who ended up being very important in my development, where we filed the first friend of the court brief with the U.S. Supreme Court dealing with why HIV, people who have HIV are disabled under federal law.
Talk more about that. Who was the person?
There was a woman who was a lawyer at the ACLU of Southern California named Susan McGreevy, and who I think you know.
I certainly do. I've got my own story about her mentorship.
Susan was is an incredible person. She really had the ability to kind of seize me, at least, I've seen her do it with other people, and say, you have to do this. This is really important. Nobody else can do this. You really have to work on this. It was this amazing ability to kind of get people to step up to the plate and use their talents to do stuff that was really going to make a difference.
So what was the situation as well about HIV and AIDS that caused you both to believe that this was the way to go?
Well, there was this case that was on its way up to the Supreme Court that we noticed at a lower level that dealt with a woman who was fired from a teaching position because she had had a history of having tuberculosis. And the question was she protected under a law that prohibited discrimination by entities that received federal funding, was the law at the time, that prohibited them from discriminating against people with disabilities. And the question is, well, could a disease, having a disease, be a disability? And would the fact that it might be contagious in certain ways preclude it being protected? Reagan was the president at the time, and his administration was taking the position that no, infectious diseases couldn't be considered disabilities. And we did this brief to the Supreme Court because it was becoming, this was back in 1983, 2005, so it was pretty early in the epidemic, that really tried to educate the court about HIV, and to kind of assuage some of their fears and make clear how it was and wasn't transmitted, and why there were people who were going to be subjected to irrational discrimination, and they should not be excluded from protection under this law. And that's ultimately, we were able to establish that.
Right.
And it's been one of the things I think has really helped an incredible number of people living with AIDS in this country.
Well, you know, it's interesting when you're talking about McGreevy, because when I came back from law school, I was working at a firm also in Los Angeles, a downtown firm, and McGreevy was at the ACLU and asked me if I would do a pro bono case about a woman, a lesbian who was a taxi cab driver for Yellow Cab here in Los Angeles, and had been fired, and the evidence sort of showed, though not overwhelmingly, because it was a little subtle, that it was really because of her sexual orientation. Now, of course, there was no law against it, so we were sort of scrounging around for a theory at the time about it. But it was Susan who was, she was teaching at one of the California State Universities here, and teaching women and law to undergraduates, and said, you know, I don't have time to teach this class, why don't you teach it for a semester? I had never even thought about teaching anything about law. And of course, as you know, I ended up teaching there, and then I started teaching in, in law schools, and for 6 years I was a law professor, and I think it was partly that got me interested in doing the law and social policy, and probably ended up, running for the legislature. And it seemed so accidental, but I see you do the same thing in terms of mentoring people and, going and getting them. These people are very, very important. But again, we don't really know, except in hindsight, that this is kind of what's happened to us. So, but you were still at the law firm doing pro bono work, but that wasn't the be-all and end-all, because I know you went, did you go right to the ACLU from that?
I actually became a partner at the firm, and after I became a partner, I really kind of wondered, okay, so is this all it's all about? I'd worked hard to try to achieve that. That had been my goal. And it really made me think, there has to be more to life than making a lot of money, which I was at the time. Now I can only remember that problem distantly. But there has to be more than that, and more than just feeling like you're doing a good job. What I was doing was important to the clients I was working for, but it really had no lasting social importance. And as I had more and more friends who were becoming sick with HIV, and who were dying from AIDS, and as I looked around at what was going on in the gay community, and became more aware of the ways in which gay people needed legal protections that weren't really there yet, I just felt like I wanted to do something else with my life. And that, in combination with how it felt to be doing that pro bono work, made me start looking around. And Susan had ended up leaving the ACLU, so they needed somebody else to come work there, and that's where I went.
And how was that?
It was terrific.
I mean, it was a big life change for you.
It was
really
a big life change. I worked at the ACLU for 7 years, doing principally lesbian and gay rights and rights of people living with AIDS, but also women's rights and rights of people with other disabilities. And I felt like an explosion of ideas started coming to me about what needed to be done, and I feel very privileged to be able to get paid to do this kind of work, because I find it so fulfilling and so exciting most of the time. I mean, I like getting up in the morning and going to work, and there's this wonderful thing about really kind of trying to, there's so many problems out there, and having the ability to kind of decide, this is what I think needs to be worked on now.
And it must have made it easier, too, for you to sort of live your life as a gay man and just be sort of in gay society. Is that the case?
Yes, well, it was interesting. Let's see, a couple years after I went to IRL, I met someone who I got involved with and was in a long-term relationship with, who, notwithstanding the fact that I'd come out to a number of people, who was a woman. And She also was a lawyer and now a law professor named Chris Littleton. She's head of the Women's Studies program at UCLA and teaches at the law school there. And we had a wonderful relationship, but it certainly was not an expected one on my part.
Right.
And it's funny, throughout our relationship, I really kind of identified as a gay man who had happened to fall in love with a woman. And it's funny because we don't really have, people don't fit so neatly into the categories that we've set up, I think, in our society. But, and you know, I can't be too critical of my brother, who was surprised because it was like confusing. Wait a minute, you're gay, but what about Chris?
No, that's true. It is confusing. And of course, Chris herself, when she teaches in women's studies and when she teaches gender and law in the law school, talks about this problem of duality. I mean, you either are the sort of the basis of part of the problem in about prejudice about sexual orientation is that society says, well, you know, could you just be exactly a man or exactly a woman? We want that bright line there. We want gender distinction, and sexual orientation doesn't fit in terms of having that bright line gender distinction. Not to mention girls who are straight and want to play basketball. I mean, you know, it's very confusing. And frankly, you didn't help that confusion, Jon, but you did, I think, make the point, or help make the point, that was so academic for so many people, that this duality thing about you either are or you aren't, and we're going to define this or that, it's much more challenging for us than that.
Well, it's hard because I do think that it's hard to do work that's about kind of identity politics without having an identity. I mean, there is, you know, a lot of the discrimination has to do with categorizing people and then saying they're different,
right.
And therefore should be treated differently. And I also think that therefore the reaction of people who experience that discrimination and experience the kind of hostility and subrogation that goes on is to create a culture, a gay culture, that I find a lot of strength from. And so it was important to me, and has been important to me, to identify as a gay man, whatever that might mean. And yet, I couldn't deny that I had these very strong feelings for this woman, who is a wonderful woman, and who now identifies as a bisexual who's in a committed relationship with another woman. So our lives have taken interesting paths, but I think that you know, one of the things that I'm finding very interesting in my work now is looking at the ways in which sex discrimination applies to or operates in the discrimination against lots of lesbians and gay men, and how we share a lot in common with people who are transgendered. Because a lot of the discomfort that heterosexuals have is that we don't meet their stereotypes, and they can't quite figure out, well, if I'm in a relationship with another man, who's the man and who's the woman in the relationship? Because that's a limited way that they have of conceiving the way relationships work. And there's some challenge to that they perceive that two men could be together and be happy, or that two women could be together and be happy.
Well, and did you experience sort of criticism from our community in your relationship with Chris? You
know, I never did. I experienced some puzzlement on the part of some people.
Wait a minute, you're the gay rights guy at the ACLU.
And, you know, ultimately, I think it did get harder as I kind of got more and more into being a gay rights lawyer for Chris and me together. I mean, I think that, you know, there were issues about kind of me identifying as gay and what that meant for her and how she felt. Well, and also
you were so thoroughly responsible about heterosexual privilege in terms of saying, you know, well, you guys can be gay, and wherever you go, you'll be discriminated against, or you'll get a bad table or whatever, but we'll walk in, we'll be a regular, you know, couple, regular, and we won't experience
it. We were never too regular, but...
No, you're never too regular. But still, and Chris was as I recall, both of you were sort of concerned about that, which many of
Well,
us thought was kind of sweet, actually.
we thought of getting married at one point and then decided that we really didn't want to do that, in part because it didn't seem right when we wouldn't have been able to get married if we had been with a
Right.
different partner.
Well, it was fun having people be really surprised because Chris, you know, if it's like John and Chris and you're gay and we get there, we're going to meet Christopher, and it wasn't Christopher, it was Christine. Watching people's faces, that was fun, who didn't actually know, you know, the tree trimming parties or whatever. But you and Chris are not together,
Right.
as I heard you say earlier.
Right. It's really, after Chris and I decided to separate, I met a really wonderful man who we just celebrated 10 years together. His name's Aaron Aronow, and he's a doctor. That made it easier when I brought him home, and my parents, you know, I'd told my parents before, no, it wasn't a phase. That is being with a woman.
Right.
You know, being gay was not a phase. Yes, I was with a woman, but that what didn't make being
But I'm
gay a
really
phase.
gay, honestly.
I'm really gay. But that I brought home a nice Jewish doctor for them was great, and he's been terrific. He now works doing research on the neurological problems of people with AIDS, and is the co-investigator for the National Neurological AIDS Bank, where they actually look at the brains of people who've died from AIDS and try to see what sort of changes have occurred as a result of the disease.
And you're not at the ACLU any longer either.
No, a little over 6 years ago, I went to Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Now, why would you make that change?
One of the things that I didn't like as much about the ACLU is I ended up working alone a lot. I mean, I'd have cooperating attorneys who I'd work with, but I didn't really feel that much of a sense of community. And it has to do with the way in which the ACLUs in each community are kind of separate from one another. At Lambda, I knew I would feel, and I have felt, an incredible camaraderie with a wonderful group of lawyers, just incredibly talented and dedicated group of people. And it also was an opportunity to move beyond just working in Southern California, but to work on a more national level. And right now I'm responsible for all of Lambda's litigation in 10 states in the West, but also work a lot on kind of the national strategy on lots of issues.
John, I know that you and I both really devoted our lives to the law in one way or another, and you certainly far more than I in this area. But many activists, I think, are wary of people who just operate within the law, though many of us obviously think it's a really important thing to have the law on your side. How effective do you think it's been to use this sort of the law as one of our tools for equality?
I think it's been incredibly effective. I mean, when, you know, I also do some teaching in law schools, and I like doing that because it's an opportunity to kind of look back and see where we were 20 years ago as compared to where we are now. And I see such a different reception of the courts to gay people and our issues, and I see incredible progress that we've made. And some of it comes from courts decreeing things. And I think one can only make limited progress that way, because if you move too quickly and the courts get too far ahead of the general public, there can be a counter-reaction. And we've seen that happen with some of these statewide initiatives. But at the same time, courts present a very visible and concrete way to play out in terms of looking at the real-life impact of certain inequalities. That is important whether you win or lose, and that frequently the lawsuits are a way of telling a story that can seize people's imaginations. That's happened with respect to, for example, the Boy Scout litigation that I've been involved with, where we, on behalf of two different cases, one in California and one that was in New Jersey, where we sued the Boy Scouts on behalf of young men who had been involved in the Boy Scouts and then were kicked out after the Boy Scouts found out that the men were gay. In both those cases, we ultimately lost in the courts, but those cases were vehicles for incredible change in public opinion. I mean, when we started those cases, the press reaction and the general public reaction I got was, why are you attacking the Boy Scouts? You know, why are you going after them? Just find your own thing to do. And the reaction now has been, why are the Boy Scouts picking on gay people? there's been an ability through having the vehicle of litigation to kind of bring this to the public's attention in a way that it never would otherwise. You know, it got taken seriously because it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. But it's really hard on the plaintiffs, isn't it?
It
And
is.
you talk about telling a story. I mean, one of the things that I've found in knowing or being able to know some of the people whose stories are being told, and we have the same thing in the legislature when you bring someone as a witness and they say, you know, my partner was killed and I didn't get any benefits, or I mean, I'm completely concerned about that after 9/11. It's very hard on the plaintiffs, don't you think?
You know, they have to really be willing to expose something about themselves and to be subject to criticism. You know, it is hard, and one of the things I've found particularly difficult is I've done a lot of work over the last couple of years dealing with young gay and lesbian people who either were subjected to harassment or violent assaults while they were in high school and the schools did not really respond appropriately, or who were just trying to found like a gay-straight alliance at their school, and the school's trying to prevent them from doing that. And you know, being a plaintiff in this kind of litigation puts an incredible limelight on you, and it has all sorts of effects upon people. And particularly for young people, it's very hard. And it requires that when we think about taking on a case, we have lots of long discussions with the people who are thinking about being plaintiffs about what this means. And I'm not sure it's easy to really get people to understand the changes that this may bring about in their life. And particularly for a number of the clients I've had who, you know, well, they got so involved in it they ended up becoming lawyers.
Well, that's scary.
Yes.
But you know, it must be very difficult because we lose a number of our cases, and especially young people or you know, young men who've gone all the way to be Eagle Scouts, and they think, well, this is discrimination. Can anyone wonder that it's discrimination if I'm good enough one day and then I tell something about myself and I'm not? They must expect to win often, even if you tell them, look, be prepared. You know, it may not. May not be our time yet.
It is hard. I mean, I think the process, since it takes usually several years to get to a result, does turn a number of them into, you know, what I sometimes call like accidental activists. In the same way that happened to Candace Gingrich. You know, that they kind of fell into becoming activists because of the attention about them, and that process I do think helps people understand a little bit more, but it is hard. I think there's, I mean, I feel it even as the lawyer, and so it's not my story that's being told, but when you lose, there is this sense of rejection that I only am able to ultimately deal with by putting it in context. And it's a lot easier to put something in context when it's not your life.
Well, you see a timeline on other kinds of civil rights and the cases that were brought and lost, and the cases that were brought and partially won but never enforced or whatever. I think people think, well, when we won, you know, the law's going to change. We got this bill through, the law's going to change.
Right.
But it's really very difficult.
You know, it is a process, and I think that the law interacts with media, with politics, with just kind of generally what's going on in society as an evolving process where there's lots of kind of back and forth effects among all of the changes that go on there. But you know, I do think, you know, example is this case that's been going on in California involving a woman whose lover was mauled to death.
By that was the
by
dog
the dog
case,
up
right?
in San Francisco, and her name's Sharon Smith, and the partner was Diane Whipple. Well, National Center for Lesbian Rights filed a lawsuit suing for wrongful death. That Sharon should be entitled to some compensation for losing the financial support and companionship of her partner. And there was a whole issue about whether California law allows someone who's not married to their partner to be able to sue. Well, that lawsuit, again, I think was very significant in us getting AB 25 passed, the law that Governor Davis signed recently, that specifically is amending that statute to say that domestic partners can sue for wrongful death. And again, it's kind of my point that the courts present a vehicle for spotlighting injustice.
And sometimes actually the law sees something coming down the pike. I mean, it's been sort of just the opposite with another aspect of that bill that has to do with adoption.
Right.
Because we have two, as you know, two different kinds of adoption laws in California, and I think it's very similar in other states where there's sort of the step-parent adoption. You marry the biological parent, and then you can be the second parent who adopts without that person giving up their parental right. Then you have sort of the stranger adoption, where all the parents have to give up their parental rights and someone else adopts the child. For our community, neither one of those worked, and California's been allowing us, as you know, to have a sort of a median category, where we could be a second parent who adopted. We can't get married, but we have committed to this child and to this partner. And so several adoptions were granted.
Actually, we think somewhere between 10 and 20,000
well,
adoptions in the
even
state.
more important to what may be happening next, because an appellate court, not the Supremes, indicated that they didn't find anything in the statute that allowed such a result. And of course, it places in jeopardy so many of the adoptions, maybe.
Right. I think it's important that people who have done second parent adoptions not panic at the moment, because the decision's not final, and there are petitions for rehearing being filed and a petition for review with the California Supreme Court, and we're hoping that this will be fixed, because it's a horrifying decision. One of the things I find particularly horrifying about it was the lack of apparent concern by the majority of this Court of Appeal on what they were doing to existing adoptions. It's a fundamental principle of adoption law that once an adoption's been entered, it's final. And that people really can't go in years later and try to question whether that adoption was properly done or not. And the court seemed to say, oh, well, what this piece of legislation did is say that now domestic partners can do step-parent adoptions. We're glad that we at least have that. I mean, that's going to.
Well, I'm not saying
it
takes the place of these other adoptions, but it does show some legislative intent, it seems to me, on our part, on the governor's part, to say, you know what, I mean, we think this is just fine.
Well, what's crazy is really all the branches of government before, other courts, the legislature by evincing its intent in passing this bill, and the executive branch by the governor having told the Department of Social Services to really go on record as permitting these adoptions to take place and supporting them.
If it's in the best interest of the child, right.
Right. And generally it is, because generally the child is living with their legal parent and the parent's partner already.
Right.
So allowing the adoption to take place creates the legal bond with somebody with whom there's usually already a psychological and emotional bond, makes it possible for that child to be on that person's health insurance, for them to continue to raise the child if anything happens to their legal parent, makes it possible for them to take the child to the hospital and sign for consents and do all sorts of other things that are necessary when you're doing child raising. And it's just very disturbing to me that, and I think reflective of the fact that we still don't have equal dignity granted to our relationships, that makes us vulnerable and makes it so important why we continue to fight for the freedom to marry. Because I really feel that until we get that, there's going to be incredible inequality perpetuated again and again against members of our community.
Well, I wish everyone had been at your 10th anniversary party to hear Aaron sing to you. I mean, no one would have doubted that. It was so lovely, wonderful. So filled with love. And Sondheim isn't even my favorite composer. I mean,
Well, he is ours.
But yes, I could see that. And it was so sweet. But I mean, it would be very difficult for people who would go out of their way to see us, to really see us, so that we're not invisible, to see our relationships. And I have a hunch that that's the other thing about this visibility. So many coming out, so many people being in long-term relationships, raising children together, that it's very difficult now for many people, in our state at least, to say, gee, I never saw one, I never met one, I don't know anybody. And it's been a great virtue, I think, of a lot of people coming out. Your relationship is exemplary of this kind of commitment. There's another legal issue, though, I wanted to talk to you about, and that goes to the military, which has been one of those issues that's been rattling around for us for a long time, and now here we are at war again. Suddenly everyone was saying, well, I heard that they lifted the ban or whatever, and now they're not going to be kicking people out on the basis of their sexual orientation. Then I heard, no, you have to read the statute very closely. It said we're going to keep all the bad apples in except for the gay people. They can still be kicked out. I mean,
that's what the Air Force is doing. What happened was that the that the Secretary of Defense issued an order saying that it was up to each of the branches to decide whether they wanted to institute what's called a stop-loss order. And that means during this period of military engagement, we won't prosecute discharges. It doesn't mean that you can come out, even if they were to have a stop-loss order that applied to gay people, because it just means we won't do it while we need you to fight the war. But afterwards, we could discharge you. And that actually happened during the Gulf War. People came out, were allowed to fight, and then they were discharged. And I know it makes your blood boil. But what's frightening to me was the Air Force said, oh, well, we will not prosecute discharges except for gay people. Those, we're still going to throw them out. In the Navy and the Army, it appears at the moment they're not at least putting this as very high priority. But it's really still not safe for people in the military to come out. And that, you know, the military is our largest employer in the United States. And it is paid for by our tax dollars, and it is continuing to discriminate. And I find that so incredibly offensive that, you know, the government that particularly at these times where many of us are feeling very patriotic, that we are still being told we can't be who we are.
Well, but it's a very powerful tool, it seems to me, for dehumanizing a community, and it's not by accident. You say to them, you may not marry, which is the way we allow human beings to marry. We don't allow you guys to marry. We allow human beings to serve in the military, although it always seemed to me that taking these young men at the age of 18, 19 was a good way of saying, we'll take young, I'll just use the term, cannon fodder, and I was in Vietnam. So I don't know that I'm so sorry that my young men in my community can't serve. But it is a way of dehumanizing us, to say, look, this is an honor, we make it an honor in society to serve, and you can't have that honor, and that's another way that we'll make certain that no one respects you.
I think one always has to be careful when drawing parallels to the experience of African Americans in this country. But it is the case that those ways of dehumanizing play themselves out over and over against different minority groups. And you know, it was the case that slaves were not allowed to marry legally, and then you know, until 1967, African Americans were not allowed to marry white people.
And it was the same with military service.
And it was the same in military service, that they either were not allowed to join or were kept separate. And so we see those same sort of ways of dehumanizing people playing themselves out again and again.
But that was the poignancy to me of the movie Glory. The long struggle for inclusion in terms of full respect and humanity, of being allowed to serve in the military, and then of course being put at the head of a group of soldiers who were just going to be blown away, essentially. Right. You know, in front. I'm not saying, you know, I'm an anti-militarist myself. Okay,
and I understand that, but I guess my view, and it is funny, if you had told me when I actually made the decision to kind of give up all the money I was making and instead go work on lesbian gay rights full-time, that I would spend the principal part of my career working to help gay people get into the military, the institution of marriage, the Boy Scouts, and employment in the LAPD. You know, try to name any more conservative institutions than those. You know, that's what it was about. But what it really is about is that those institutions were both engaging in the most adamant and express out there discrimination, and in many ways were creating the most harm. Because those are the institutions that kind of stand for what it means to be an American. And we were being systematically excluded from each of them. You know, you couldn't defend your country in war or in peacetime in the police department. And you couldn't be in the country's largest youth group. And you couldn't be in the main institution that you know, it defines family life in America. And so, you know, it has been critical to do each of those things. But for me, it's about not whether I would want to do each of those things, but do people have choice? And are we being excluded unfairly?
Well, sure. I mean, that's when we say, I'll fight for equality, we're sort of stuck. Because we are required then to fight for equality as the people who want it kind of define it. and not whether we say, oh, you don't want to be equal to those people, you know, you might get killed.
And it is a problem. I mean, part of the whole issue of the struggle for respect for our families, you know, is, well, should we seek marriage, or should there be some alternatives for people who don't really like that institution? And I've always tried to work for both. You know, I felt like, well, there are some things that I think are only going to come from marriage, and so it's very important that we have that. But there are some people who may not want to get married for one reason or another, and that doesn't mean that they should have no rights.
Well, and it's also, I think, too easy for us not to treat the other person fairly if we're not allowed to marry. I mean, it's sort of a flip side of, yes, it's not a great privilege to be able to go through divorce, but we do say as a state, look, there's just certain lines of fairness in terms of spousal support, in terms of child support, in terms of community property, or in other states, marital property, and the equal division of it, or the fair and just division of it. And we go into a relationship, and maybe it doesn't work out, and the rich one says, bye, I have no responsibility to you, because good thing the law didn't let us marry. And I always thought that was really a terrible thing for us to be able to simply not have that responsibility as well. It's sort of,
you know, this case that we were talking about before, the second parent adoption case, one of the things that I find shocking is the case involves two lesbians who were really kind of leaders in our community, Sharon Silverstein and Annette Friskoff. And Sharon and Annette met at Harvard Business School, getting their MBAs, wrote a book together about lesbians in the corporate world. They did a second parent adoption together of their first child, and they were doing it of their second child when they broke up. And then Sharon took the position that these adoptions are not permitted under California law. I find that just unacceptable. I find it unacceptable for people to be members of our community, to be out there giving other people advice about what needs to be done in our community, to try to take advantage of things when it suits them, and then to take advantage of the homophobia that's still out there in the courts to do what suits them at a particular time.
But it's not unheard of. I was a family law attorney before I was a law professor. People do unfair things, you know, when they break up or even when they get divorced. But I would rather that we would have the same responsibilities. It's not so much entering into this institution of marriage as though it's the only privilege that we should want, but it didn't work so well for them, so maybe we shouldn't want it. I think we should want the protections that the state provides, just as we would provide certain protections or benefits that come along with marriage economically, even while you're married. And it is interesting that we're sort of eking them out one at a time. The question about domestic partners, for instance, I was thinking the other day, well, we allow seniors to register as domestic partners. There are certain requirements in terms of what you share, but it seems to me that friends over the age of 65 may want to register, companions, you know, non-sexual companions, to register as domestic partners to gain this kind of, I can help you in terms of your health, I can be there as your conservator if you lose it, you know, whatever. That it would be a useful model for older people who have never had a way to commit legally to each other just as friends and, you know, sort of taking care of each other in their golden years.
You know, I don't see how the government or society loses at all by us having ways of recognizing and even honoring commitment of one person to another person. And I do believe that there should be multiple ways that that can be done. You know, it used to be that there were some people who, men and women, who got married to one another in order to, not because they had a romantic relationship, but because it suited them economically or provided that sort of someone to take care of them, and that was what their relationship was about. And we didn't go question them about that, you know? And so why shouldn't that be equally available in some way to a same-sex couple that decide to do that, or to friends of the same sex?
Well, you know, we've actually, in our community, it seems to me, we've led the way, sometimes without even meaning to, about these concepts of fairness or of common sense commitment to each other, because we've had to build our relationships virtually out of no legal protection at all.
When you don't have the rules applying to you, you have to make things up as you go along, and sometimes that leads to some great creativity and new ways and I think it's important that those be respected at the same time as we're seeking full equality under the law.
So what do you see for our community kind of next in the legal arena? And then I want to kind of take a broader look maybe at that.
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing advances on a number of fronts. The rights of young people, the rights of the elderly, we're increasingly seeing, you know, as our activists get older, you know, there's a focus on some of these issues about what does happen to seniors when they need assisted living facilities or nursing homes, and what are those policies. I think that there's going to continue to be a tremendous look at relationships and a fight for marriage, continued exploration of things like civil unions or reciprocal beneficiary relationships or domestic partnerships. You know, I think that there's a lot of work to be done kind of again in exploring what happens as we raise families. Those are all very, very important issues. We still have a lot of work to do in fighting employment and housing discrimination. We still only have 11 states in the country that actually have laws prohibiting employment discrimination. You know, there's still a lot of work to do. But we've made tremendous advances. If you look back just 10 years, you look back 20 years, it is a very different legal landscape than it used to be.
How do you think we've done as a community just in sort of winning the culture war, as it were, in this country anyway?
You know, I do feel we're winning there too. I mean, it's hard having you know, lost the Knight Initiative, the proposition in California that said that we were not going to allow marriages, same-sex marriages that might be permitted in other states to be recognized here. It lost that by 61%, to feel like, oh, we're there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that just shows how much more work we have to do. I think the fact that we've broken through in the media, both in news coverage and in TV and movies and the music industry, gives me a lot of hope because, you know, frankly, when I was growing up, there were like no gay people on the scene that I could really have much of a clue about what it meant to be gay. And I think one of the wonderful things about working with some of the young people that I've worked with, it's like, it is amazing this kind of lack of conflict, internal conflict in some of these 14, 15, 16-year-olds who are lesbian, gay, and proud of it and not going to take anything from anybody else, and that gives me incredible hope.
So Jon, as you think of this first half of your life, which is really sort of what it is, hopefully, you know, knock wood, please, are you happy you made these choices?
I'm very happy. I feel very lucky to be able to get up in the morning and do work that I care passionately about. And I really have been amazed at my colleagues, the people that I work with, both at Lambda and at other organizations, the level of selflessness, the level of dedication to this work. There's some incredibly wonderful people. And I just, you know, I really do feel like it is incredibly fulfilling to be able to spend your life doing stuff that you really care about.
And it's interesting, people say to me, well, Sheila, are you having fun up there in Sacramento? And you know me, it's hard for me to lie, but I don't want to go into big, long explanations. Right. But I like to say to them, it's, you know, mostly it's not fun. Like, fun. Fun might be going to a movie or going to the beach or, you know, playing with kids. But there's a great joy to me in it, which is, it's different. Right.
No, it's not a game. It's not that. It's and there are days when it's very difficult. There are days when you just can't believe that the opposing counsel did something in this case, or that that a court reacted in a certain way to a presentation that you made. But there is a sense, fulfillment is the best word that I can give, a sense of knowing that you're doing what you should be doing.
And that it's sort of using you up. I mean, I don't mean totally burnout.
No.
That's different. but I have all of these things that I can do. And we've had this conversation, and I think I certainly feel like my job requires me to use all of those parts of myself that I've developed. And I know, at least I think you feel pretty much the same.
Well, one of the great things about doing this kind of work as opposed to when I was in a private law firm is my days are filled with so many different kinds of work. I mean, I'm not just a litigator. I'm writing op-eds and doing things with the media and giving other lawyers advice and giving people in community-based organizations advice and giving legislators and their aides advice, and kind of feel like I have my fingers in lots of different things, but at the same time feel like it's great to where the client in all these cases, in everything I do, is my community.
Mm-hmm.
That feels great.
Well, our hour is up. I can't believe it. It goes by so fast for me. So thank you, Jon Davidson. Thank you very much for being with us. Those of you who are thinking, gee, I don't know, maybe I might like a career doing something to, as my colleagues say, kick the can down the street a little bit on the rights of our community. And I would say that if you get such a job, get used to it.